votes. It is meant to enrage the left. It is meant to provoke the charge of inhumanity. And it creates a contest. Whose indignation is more righteous, the right's or the left's? You could say that Gary Lineker fell into a trap. He was provoked to cross a line that the BBC cannot ignore. He used the N-word by implicitly comparing the government to the Nazis. The N-word is nuclear. But ironically, the very thing that the right-wing press barons hate most about the BBC, that it is paid by an enforced tax, by a licence fee, is what gives Lineker a shield. We pay for his vast salary. Whether he's an opinionated freelancer or not, we pay for him out of our pockets, not the BBC bosses, out of theirs. They're merely there to manage the process, and they are very good at tying themselves into pretzels. And now they've lost Gary, they've lost Shearer, they've lost Wright, they've stripped Match of the Day of its familiar voices, and they may well lose the stands around the country. You mess with Gary, you mess with much of British public opinion. And of course, they've imposed this rule of impartiality on him, but not on Alan Sugar, host of The Apprentice, who slammed the industrial strikers and told people to vote Tory in a tweet. They've not suspended Richard Sharp, the BBC chairman, while he's subject to 2 investigations about whether he got his job because he helped Boris Johnson get a whopping loan while he was Prime Minister. So, it's been a bad week for the people trying to run the BBC. Its enemies will be cheering or laughing. But I get back to my unintended consequences. What was Gary's tweet about? It was about the language used by a government that still likes to stir up emotions. They think they're on safe ground when it comes to attacking asylum seekers. They might even fight the next election on this turf. But Gary and his people are just beginning to get organised. Who knows where this will lead? Everyone loses in this game of political football. Gary may well lose his job. The BBC loses its appearance of impartiality, possibly its impartiality. And the government may lose its humanity as it tries very hard not to lose the next election. We have a lot to talk about this morning. Let's start off with Alastair Campbell, former Director of Communications for Tony Blair and co-host of The Rest is Politics podcast, which of course is produced by Goalhanger Podcast, a company owned by Gary Lineker. Good morning, Alastair.
Hi, Matt. How are you?
Very well. Good to speak to you again. It's not been a while, has it? It was only last night on Channel 4 News, but here we are again. And I'll start with the same question I started with last night. Did the BBC really have any choice, considering that Gary Lineker deployed the N-word?
Well, look, I think that they did have a choice, and the choice that I think they should have taken once the Tory party and the Tory paper started to whip it up is to point out some of the things that you just pointed out about Alan Sugar and about others, and there are dozens that we could dredge out, and there's been lots of debate about lots of them, and then said that, as we've made clear, there are guidelines, they have to be followed. Gary was not speaking on the BBC, he was engaged in exchange on Twitter. They could have said, perhaps he could have phrased it better, but we see no need for any further action. End of story. Instead of which, because of the political pressure, because of these wretched extremist newspapers like the Mail and the Express and the Telegraph, whipping this up for all it's worth, with these culture warrior Tory MPs piling in, then it's led to where it's led now. And I think you used the phrase the BBC tying themselves in knots. That is exactly what they've done. They've done it because of political pressure. They've done it because of political pressure coming out of Downing Street and the Home Office, but they've also done it because of the pressure of having at the top of the organisation and having on the board people like Richard Sharp, as you say, Johnson loan fixer, best friend of Sunak, who has got literally next to no experience of broadcasting whatsoever, let alone a public service, and people like Robbie Gibb, who has been on this revolving door from the Brexit campaign, BBC, in and out of GB News, Tory party, etc., etc., etc. They are the people, those two are the people who should be walking out the door, not Tim Davie, actually, who I think has been put in an impossible position by them and by the government, and certainly not Gary Lineker, Alan Shearer, Ian Wright, Mark Chapman, Alex Scott, and all the other people who have done exactly the right thing in refusing to be bystanders to something that's so wrong.
But it is about language, isn't it? The government, as I've said before, uses fairly extreme language on some issues, especially on the issue of asylum seekers and small boats. And although Gary Lineker did not spell out the word Nazi, didn't even call it the N-word, There is an implicit comparison there between this government and the government in Germany in the 1930s, right? So was that language over the top?
I don't believe so, and I'll tell you why I feel this so strongly. I've got a book coming out in a few months, and it's about the state of our politics, and part of that's about the state of our media. And I actually look at, both in the United States and in the UK, at some of the parallels between 30s Germany and what's been happening in our debate. And if you just, as you say, Gary Lineker was talking about the language. Where do you think drain the swamp came from? That was Mussolini. Where did enemies of the people come for judges? That came from Der Stürmer, the sort of, Nazi-backing paper in the 30s. This is dangerous stuff. And it's dangerous stuff that Suella Braverman, in particular, I don't know what Sunak stands on this, but I even think what he said the other day, Keir Starmer, a lefty lawyer, as though, being a lawyer who takes the brief of people like refugees and asylum seekers is somehow a betrayal of Britain. I mean, this is disgusting stuff. And I think that what Gary Lineker's done, somebody who, without shouting it from the rooftops, has been consistent in his support for refugees, who doesn't sort of, go on the television and say, vote this way or vote that way. If he'd have said what he said, Matt, sitting in the Match of the Day chair, after, punditing on Liverpool against Arsenal, I can see why the BBC would have a point. I can see why the Tories would be angry. But he didn't. He said it on Twitter.
But he's got 8.8 million followers. There is a fuzzy line there, isn't there? I mean, he's got his profile.
It's about the principle.
Yeah.
It's either right or it's wrong. It's either within the guidelines or it's not. If it's not within the guidelines, and it is as clear as they're now claiming, why wasn't action taken straight away? Why wasn't action taken when, for example, I was involved in the People's Vote campaign? Boris Johnson's brother, Joe Johnson, came out for a second referendum. Gary Lineker came to the event, and we got him to interview Joe Johnson on stage, and Gary Lineker pinned his Brexit colours to the mast. Why was that? And by the way, on the others, in another debate, Brian Cox, the scientist, are they going to pull his programme? You go through Brian Cox's social media feed, and it's relentless in him calling out the realities of Brexit. Relentless. Is he going to get pulled? Is Attenborough going to get pulled because he's going to upset these sort of climate change deniers who are part of the right-wing extreme in the Conservative Party? This is madness, Matt, and it's absolute madness.
But did the